Again, I appreciate everybody joining today. We do expect a couple of folks to jump on, especially with the late start today. Again, apologies for that. But I'd like to welcome you guys to the May edition of our Delaying Lean Business Agility webinar. For this month, our topic is Water-Scrum-Fall, myth or magic. This one hits close to home for me because I think the reality is that Water-Scrum-Fall is kind of a hybrid model that a lot of us do observe in a lot of corporate environments with a lot of clients and different organizations. So the whole point of today's discussion is to take a few minutes, talk about what Water-Scrum-Fall is, kind of define it. Is it a myth or magic? Is it something that we only hear about in story tales, in blog posts, or is it kind of the magic recipe to help organizations become more agile and deliver projects faster with less risk and on time? So ultimately, that'll be a question for you guys to ask yourselves at the end of the webinar. But certainly, if you guys have any questions or thoughts while we dig into the topic, feel free to stop me. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get things kicked off here. And the major thing is, before we begin, just wanted to kind of introduce ourselves, myself, for any new folks that have dialed in that haven't been with us for previous webinar forums. But my name's Frank. I'm a principal consultant with Delaying Consulting, specialized in business transformation, but I'm also a certified Scrum Master and certified SAFe practitioner. So ultimately, most of my time is spent working with clients and working with individuals to try to help them be more agile and think more agile. So along with me, I have Fadi Zachary. He's one of our partners with Delaying Consulting as well. He's kind of the brainchild behind our unique approach to business transformation called Lean Business Agility. So we'll certainly take a little bit of a look at our 4x4 that we use with a lot of our different engagements. But as I mentioned, today we always kick off with how the topic aligns with our pillars, our beliefs here over at Delaying. But we do want to define a couple of things about traditional waterfall and traditional agile delivery methods. What are some of the pros and cons of each, advantages, disadvantages, and how do they differ? We'll dig into defining what Water-Scrum-Fall is, if it's real or if it's make-believe. But again, we'll kind of go through some of the history there and what it really means. And then before we wrap up, I want to lay out a couple of the key differences between more traditional waterfall or agile delivery methods and some of these hybrid models like Water-Scrum-Fall that are emerging or that have emerged over the past several years. So we'll present you guys, the audience, with the case for using Water-Scrum-Fall, the case against it, and some things to monitor. And then ultimately, again, a lot of us might find ourselves in these kinds of environments where we say that we're agile or that they're agile, but in reality, it's kind of a hybrid or a mixed bag of different approaches and techniques. So if you find yourself in a case where there is a little bit of this hybrid Water-Scrum-Fall model in place, what are some tips? What are some enablers to make it successful? And then certainly if we have any thoughts before we wrap up, we got some fun stuff to share as always, and we'll open it up for questions and discussion at the end. Okay. So before we begin, just wanted to kind of lay out the foundation of how today's theme, talking about Water-Scrum-Fall, really fits into our LBA pillars. And again, for anybody that's new on the webinar, this is our first webinar, welcome. From a Delaying perspective, we here at Delaying believe that business agility, business transformation efforts are solely, the product of several different things: the culture, the talent, the kind of business, and so forth. So in order to kind of come up with a framework for approaching business transformation and making it last and making it sustainable, Fadi and our teammates have come together to refactor what we call our LBA pillars, Business Agility 4x4. So it's 4 pillars, and on each pillar, there's 4 rungs, and these are some of the major industry-proven points or techniques that we want to implement for that sustainable and lasting change. So when we think about Water-Scrum-Fall or models in particular, there's a few different rungs that this hits on our business 4x4. Under the cultural transformation aspect, certainly a big part of any way of being more agile and doing more agile work. It always starts with the mindset. For new folks on the call, we do have a previous webinar recording. It talks at length about how you can help enable the agile mindset, so I encourage you to check that out. But again, I think a lot of people kind of take this as common sense that before you really start to ingrain some of the different ways of being agile and being more responsive, enabling feedback loops and so forth, you need to condition the mind. You need to get people to think and act a little differently. So that's definitely the case with any kind of model or any kind of delivery vehicle, and that's definitely true for what we're going to talk about today. Second, under transformation as well, is customer experience. Certainly, again, we want to always keep the customer at the forefront of what we do from a delivery perspective as well as from a solutioning perspective. So when you think about hybrid models and ultimately incorporating more agile ways of working, the customer experience should be forefront. So we'll talk a little bit about how customer experience actually helps shape what Water-Scrum-Fall is today and why it's becoming so popular in certain areas. Moving over to the right, under Agile delivery, this definitely hits the Agile methodology and tools because it is part Agile. And then from a coaching and center of excellence perspective, again, I'm not making a bold declaration today that Water-Scrum-Fall is good or bad. You guys can form your own opinions about that. But as coaches, when we continue to work with the local community and build lasting and sustainable change, we want to proliferate the right ways of working. And again, a lot of that is going to be based on the culture, the customer, the type of work they're doing. But certainly as a coach, it's always good to know different kinds of ways that we can deliver value. And that includes hybrid models and all the different tools in the Agile toolbox. All right. So with that being said, Fadi, if you're on the line and you don't mind, I wanted to see if you could get us kicked off with just talking about some of the different cases where you would consider Waterfall or Agile and some of your thoughts about when it's right to use one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely, Frank. Thank you for the introduction. We typically give this chart as a guide for our teams on real life. How do they, because that's really the very first question that they will come and ask. What is best suited for Waterfall and what's best suited for Agile? Because definitely we're not going to throw Waterfall in the garbage. We build expertise, we got certifications on Waterfall, and there are some initiatives that might be suited for Waterfall, so we're not gonna throw it in the garbage, but at least we're gonna use it in the interim until we ramp up the expertise to carry everything afterwards in an agile manner. But during that ramp up, there was always the question of, okay, how do we decide now that we have a smaller group of agile practitioners? We cannot just dump everything on them, otherwise we're going to choke them, and then we'll come back and say agile didn't work. So how do we choose what we keep with the existing teams of waterfallers and what we will give to the smaller team, which is growing but smaller now, of agilists? So we built this very simple chart that you see on Frank's screen to give them an indication of how to do that choice. On the y-axis, it says the visibility of technology capability. So your understanding of the capability of your infrastructure, obviously low and high. And on the x-axis is your understanding of the customer needs in terms of what bells and whistles we need to build for our service or our product. Again, low and high. So these two axes, they create 4 quadrants. The top right quadrant, which is high of our understanding of what the customer truly needs, something similar to a website. We're building a website, and we've done that website so many times. We built websites over and over. So we typically understand what the customer wants. It wants a sign up page, navigation screen, menu screen, certain features, look and feel. So it's more or less, we understand to a great extent what the customer needs. So you're gonna put it on the high side. And also that website that we're building is more or less using technology infrastructure that we've used more over and over, and we understand what is the capability of these platforms. So a website built is high in that quadrant. And in that case, with similar products, Waterfall and Agile will yield similar results. So if
Mhm.
if your portfolio have similar products, then don't rush into moving them to Agile, okay? But keep them with Waterfall for now, but rather look at low quadrants, things like blockchain, Internet of Things. These are types of products that would benefit a lot from the nature of the experimental nature of Agile, where we deliver smaller chunks to the customer so we understand best what the customer wants. And also that experimentation will allow us to build the technology capability because it's not really mature enough at this stage. So we all hear about blockchain and applications in various industries, right? But we don't
Mhm.
really know whether it's mature enough in terms of all the capabilities, or we still need to experiment with. So similar products, these are the types of products or projects that we would give first to the smaller Agile team as it grows and experiments, and then become eventually a full-fledged organization that can handle a lot of products. So
Great.
that's the slide that we give to customers to give them an indication what would benefit a newly built Agile team, and
Mhm.
what other products that can remain within the Waterfall team.
Great.
Okay. Do you want me to continue, Frank, or you will take it from here?
Yeah, yeah, no, if you don't mind, I like that. This is one I know we use a lot too, Fatty, but I thought this is
Yeah.
a good representation of the different traditional waterfall versus agile. Do you see certain value? Do you lower your risk?
Yeah.
You lower or increase risk tolerance? You want to speak to this for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not coincidental that we have these slides in order. So we start with the tool that will help us decide whether we keep it with the Waterfall team or move it to the Agile team. We decide with that view first, but then we also look into these 4 elements, okay, before making that final decision, should we move this way or that way. We look at the business value. Do we really need an immediate realization of business value out of this product? And if that's the case, then I'm talking about business value, the left top corner. And then you would say, yes, I need an immediate return out of this product. So in that case, Agile is going to be best fit, because Agile will be based on the incremental nature of delivery of Agile. You start to realize value sooner than traditional Waterfall. And you might come and say, hey, but who wouldn't want to realize immediate value? What kind of question is that? Of course I want to realize immediate value. I would challenge you and say, but in some cases you might not, that might not be your prime need. And the simple example is, if your product is the type of product that will yield revenue or value long term, because it's more of an infrastructural product. So you're building an infrastructure for 5G, for example. The market is not really ready for 5G now. We don't have devices that support 5G. We don't know even the width and breadth of all kinds of applications that would require 5G. So
Mhm.
it doesn't make sense that I rush and put it in the market, and I know the market is not ready, so I'm not going to immediately realize value. In that case, I would say, okay, so in that case, we're realizing immediate value is not really our prime need. So in that case, it points to the Waterfall, not points to the Agile. Okay, so that's an example.
Right.
The other one is risk. Okay, based on my understanding of the product at hand, or the project at hand, does it have a lot of risk associated with it? If it does, then I would go with Agile. Why? Because Agile, again, due to the incremental nature of delivery, it mitigates a lot of risk. You deliver a smaller chunk, and then you experiment with it and test it with the customer. Customer would come back and say, hey, this is not working fine. change it. So you would change it in the next iteration and next increment. So you avoid the risk by that incremental nature of delivery. While in waterfall, you go in a vacuum. You develop the whole 9 yards, your whole value proposition, and then all of a sudden you expose it to the customer. So if there is a lot of risk elements there, they're gonna jump at you immediately. So that's from a risk standpoint. Transparency, Agile continues to remain transparent because you guys are aware of all kinds of ceremonies and meetings and collaboration of Agile, where in Waterfall, there is a lot of handoff. So I work on my own space alone, finish whatever I'm doing, and then hand it over to Frank. So this kind of handoff nature of Agile inherit the opposite of transparency. So I'm more of working in a silo, and I'm not high in transparency. So if you require transparency for whatever reason, and it's critical for your product, then go the Agile path. Last but not least, and definitely my favorite, is the adaptability nature of Agile. Again, due to the incremental nature of delivery, you're able to pivot and change real quick. So you test with something, and the customer come back saying, hey, this is not suitable, or I changed my mind, and I have new requirements now. So it's easier to change because you're not carrying a big load like in Waterfall. In Waterfall, you build a lot of pieces, or a big piece, I should say, right? A big piece, and then you deliver it to the customer. So if the customer wants to change anything, it's very difficult to change with that big piece you developed. Okay.
Yep.
So these are the 4 quadrants, Frank.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. And, you know, obviously, as a business agility coach, myself, along with Fadi, you know, I think that the major message here, guys, is that ultimately there's a lot of different factors that will define what the best model or what the best approach is when you deliver a project. And we'll explore that further and dive deeper over the coming slides. But in most cases, Agile, you know, the whole point about Agile is identifying and responding to change and putting things to action. So when we think about realizing business value, you know, certainly it's important to kind of start showing value early and realize that value early. As Fadi mentioned, you know, being transparent, obviously that's critical. You want to make sure that you're on the path to fulfilling customer expectations and delivering value. Reducing risk, always important, but adaptability, yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of cases, especially with emerging technology, where you know what you know and you don't what you don't. So the sooner you can continue to reinforce those learning and feedback loops, the more that you can kind of maintain transparency, the sooner you'll realize value. So, you know, again, you'll get there either way, right? I think that's kind of the message, is Waterfall or Agile. You'll get to, fingers crossed, you'll get to the promised land on what you're trying to deliver, but how fast you get there, or how frequent you can expose certain things, Agile typically has the advantage there. But, you know, again, thanks Fadi for going through those slides, but we're gonna challenge a little bit of this conventional thinking and over the coming slides. And before we go too far into the hybrid models, we just wanted to kind of take a little bit of what Fadi was alluding to on the differences between Waterfall and Agile delivery, and organize them in a way that kind of really lays out what some of the advantages, disadvantages of each are, and the differences, I should say. But from a planning and refining scope perspective, which is really critical from a Waterfall and an Agile perspective, traditionally in a Waterfall fashion, there would be a project plan, typically a lot more elaborate than the initial first cases for discovery and assessing on the Agile side of the house. But things like BRDs, FRDs, your business and functional requirements come to mind. And in a lot of cases, you know, the goal here is to come up with a plan, do a lot of work up front to define where it is that you're starting, what work you need to do to get to the final destination, and what the end product and result looks like. So definitely a strong favor towards structuring and sticking to the plan. On the Agile side of the house, though, you guys may have heard about, you know, big room planning, PI planning, product increment planning, story mapping. There's a lot of different vehicles to ultimately get the voice of the customer out to make sure that you have a good idea of what the value looks like and translating that into an actual deliverable or multiple deliverables. So in this case, while there is still a good amount of planning, Agile doesn't condone no planning. The opposite says, do some planning, but do just enough to get started. Do just enough to get you set off on the right foot, and then continuously look for ways to respond and flex with changes that emerge over time. So those are some of the key differences between the two from a planning and refining scope perspective. When you get into development and execution, this is where they differ. Traditionally, on a waterfall side of the house, your major efforts, your design, development, UAT testing, SIT, regression, a lot of the testing phases at the end, they're treated like little projects. And there's some benefits to that for sure. It allows you to operate in a sequential fashion. It allows you to kind of manage every effort with its own, toll gate, so to speak, where you make sure you only start the next phase when you've completed the last one, and you only enter a phase when you're done with all the bells and whistles. So the one biggest drawback in a waterfall fashion, in my opinion at least, is limited engagement by business owners. So when you think about business agility, you want to partner with your business. You want to make sure the voice of the customer is represented always. That being said, some people look at limited engagement by business owners as a benefit in the traditional waterfall method, mainly because if you've taken the time to involve the business and some of those key stakeholders up front, to put it nicely and respectfully, sometimes you don't want people coming up and mucking up your process. You don't want people throwing their weight around and adding their opinions. However, we do know, as Fadi again alluded to, a lot of things can change from the time you start a project to the time you get to delivery and deployment. So on the Agile side of the house, they try to not take on individual phased effort approaches like, we're just going to develop now, and then when we're done with all development, we're going to test. Instead, again, they focus on transparency, focus on learning. So design, build, and test are typically managed sprint by sprint if we're talking Scrum, or they're, one developer would make sure that they have a hand in design, they build and develop of what's expected, but then there's also the test happening right away, so you're not waiting to the end testing phases to identify defects or issues. So again, the biggest thing here from a development execution perspective is Agile does encourage a much more incremental and iterative way of developing. As I mentioned, we traditionally associate this with Scrum using sprints, but there's many, many different Agile ways of delivering products. And then the most important thing, as I mentioned, from my opinion, is the frequent engagement with the business owner. When you are working in an iterative fashion, there is more of a premium to ensure that what you're doing jives with the customer. So that's one of the key distinct differences here on the development and execution side. And as we look ahead to delivery and release, the waterfall side of the house, you want to maintain system integrity. There's certain levels of control that you respect in order to ensure quality. So typically there's this concept of release management by an external group. Usually there's a handoff to a prod support or operations group, somebody that is specialized in making sure that the right code goes where it needs to and that regions are managed accordingly. But in addition, when you get to delivery and release, it's important for the project management team, for a lot of these support and operations folks, including leadership, to make sure that they maintain focus on actually completing the project, that everything that they agreed and planned for has been achieved and been completed. So some benefits there for sure. On the Agile side of the house, especially for smaller projects or for products when there's multiple versions or iterations, it is better to have a release on demand kind of cadence. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all here, but if you stifle the development effort by requiring a third party or a different group to be in charge of releases, or if you restrict the developer's ability to, do their own design, build, and test, and then they are restricted from moving into production, that can create delays. So, certainly that aspect of timeliness plays into the Agile delivery and release component here, but again, we've driven this point home a few times, but focusing on enabling feedback loops and refactoring, one of the critical advantages of being Agile is it's not quite as rigid. It provides you with those opportunities to refactor as you work and not wait till the end for any surprises. All right. So with that being said, I wanted to kind of, lay the foundation for the differences between waterfall and being more agile. And that leads us to the main crux of our conversation today, which is Water-Scrum-Fall. You may have heard about it, you may have not, you might call it something completely different, but regardless, Water-Scrum-Fall is a hybrid. It's believed to be coined by Mr. David West and Forrester Research. I'll make sure to send a copy of this deck so you guys can dig into the resources and reference a little bit more. But around 2011, we started seeing Water-Scrum-Fall as a term emerge in various blogs. At that point, the narrative is that while most companies say that they are agile or they are doing work in an agile fashion, the reality is that they were being more agile, but still kind of leaning on the traditional waterfall way of delivering and planning projects. So hence, Dave West and a couple of other folks during that time decided to kind of coin and lovingly refer to those early hybrid observations as Water-Scrum-Fall. So it takes a lot of the basic application lifecycle management tenets of delivering via waterfall method, but it does incorporate agile development techniques. And in particular, the initial phases where we talk about planning and designing, those are what we would call upstream. Those are more of the water part of this. So the first couple of important phases are still taken from a waterfall kind of approach. The trailing phases at the tail end of that, where typically we do the big push for testing, the big deployment, those are part of the waterfall, traditional waterfall approach as well. But it's that sweet spot right in the middle, the main dev effort where the development happens and the code is getting worked and refactored. That's typically the ripest area for teams to adopt agile ways of working. And in particular, again, Scrum is not the only way to incorporate and do more agile. But in this case, it makes a lot of sense, which is why it has a lot of gravity when you look at some of these hybrid models. So again, just a major call out. Typically, development teams, because Agile has been around for such a long time, especially in software development circles and industries, usually the dev team gravitates towards a more Agile way of working more easily. So, not to add too much commentary at this point, but that's why these hybrid models continue to have some sense of success and longevity, because people have a certain level of comfort with planning and designing up front in a traditional way. But then when it gets to the dev effort, it's more familiar these days to kind of operate in an iterative and agile fashion. So usually we'll see the dev team really hit the agile way of working. And then, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the one big caveat is that once the development effort is kind of done and we run through that part of the project, the biggest difference is now we kind of revert back to waterfall. So instead of a traditional agile way of delivery where the team is empowered to deliver on time or release on demand, there is traditionally some kind of operations go live team or some strategy to then take that code that was developed and ultimately move it into production. So again, we have a little visual on the right that you guys can refer to, but as I mentioned, the front end, the upstream, and the tail end, the downstream are traditional waterfall, and in that sweet spot for Agile and Scrum is really in the middle during the dev effort. So one quick fun fact for you guys here, and again, once I send out the slides, you're welcome to read up more about it, but you may have heard of a hybrid like this called Agile as well. In some of my research, while it's very similar, it does have a bigger emphasis on discovery and prioritization as we would typically work them from an end-to-end agile fashion. So definitely worth a read, but the biggest hybrid by far that's emerged over the last several years is Water-Scrum-Fall. So that'll be the focus for today. All right, and next up, wanted to give you guys a little bit of, some tidbits to think about and form your own opinions about. Is this good? Is this good for us? Is it not good? Is it not good for my organization or my client? We'll let you decide. But first, we wanted to present the case for Water-Scrum-Fall and why it may be valuable for your organization or your projects. As you guys might have already summarized, it does provide the best of both worlds. That's a very relative statement, but essentially, if you work in an environment that is, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, where some organizations or some teams are starting to take some of those initial steps towards business agility, but you still have a lot of traditional IT or operations organizations that haven't made that shift. This is a really comfortable and familiar way for them to manage those major phases of the project, but still providing a little bit of flexibility, especially during that critical dev time. In addition, it definitely allows teams and orgs, like the example that I just mentioned, to take a couple of baby steps to make the shift to Agile. So there are cases when pushing the kids all the way in the pool at the same time makes sense. Some organizations are just too large to scale, or there's a lot more sensitivities to the culture and the environment that prohibit them from making that full-on Agile shift all at once. So finding this kind of a hybrid way of working really helps mitigate some of those gaps and smooths out the transition for everyone involved. In addition, there's a lot of siloed organizations that, we might still find ourselves working with. IT, comes to mind, traditional like back-end marketing, HR areas. They may not have made that full shift to working in an Agile fashion. So when you have a project that cuts across multiple work streams or some of these siloed organizations, it is possible that Water-Scrum-Fall will be a better approach. Especially in the early upstream phases of planning when you're looking at requirements. There's a lot of mechanics that make it a little easier to kind of work with everybody at once and up front to make sure that all the risks and those kinds of things are identified. So some value there. In addition, the traditional means of planning, budgeting, documenting projects, that works for a lot of people. However, you still want to give your development team the ability to be nimble and the ability to kind of do things like demo and meet during daily stand-ups to work in a way that's conducive to developing the right product and getting it out the door quickly. So again, these hybrids kind of provide a little bit of the best of both worlds in that it gives you the traditional, safe, comfortable way of planning, budgeting, documenting, and monitoring status, but it gives a little bit more autonomy to the development effort, which is one of the more critical parts of the project. And then lastly, just to kind of wrap up, there is some value in compartmentalizing some of the downstream testing and release efforts. Again, I'm thinking of big organizations when I make this declaration, but typically you do want to test as soon as possible during the life cycle of any project, because quite frankly, the longer you wait to find defects and issues, the more expensive, the more time it's going to cause, more delays it's going to cause too. So ideally, you want to do testing at the same time, but if it's a big project, if it's a big migration project or system migration, lift and shift, one of those things, there could be value if you have that traditional dedicated team of testers, or you leverage some offshore folks to kind of do that all in bulk. So again, depending on the right fit for you, your client, the organization, it may make sense to kind of compartmentalize some of those downstream phases and have them managed separately. But most importantly, I think it still provides a lot of time and extra attention during the initial ideation and planning phases, which for some of us, Agilists, you definitely want to take the time up front to identify the customer needs, map out the journey, identify risk. That's super critical. So in a Water-Scrum-Fall kind of a model, it still gives you the luxury of being able to take some time to do that without feeling rushed. So those are some of the distinct benefits. So in summary, definitely consider this when Agile is happening in pockets. There's certain levels of comfort from using the more traditional ways of delivering. Small projects might be good candidates for this. And in addition, there's a lot of cases where you have to work across multiple silos. So definitely something to keep in mind. Now, for the 7 down, the case against it, why wouldn't you want to consider Water-Scrum-Fall? Well, for a similar reason, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, it may stifle your ability to transform. As consultants, business transformation consultants at that, here at Delane, we certainly want to change the mindset and get people to think and work differently. And sometimes it's not always that easy for a bunch of different variables and factors, but depending on what your strategic priorities are and what leadership is, where leadership is trying to take you in their vision, be warned that these hybrid models may foster the old way of thinking and inhibit your ability to transform your business. So that's one of the biggest things to think about is what's happening in the environment around you, and is this kind of approach going to kind of get you closer to that, or is it actually going to act as a speed bump? So certainly there's other complications that can arise. by not committing to a single method, you may be disruptive in the bad way, and it may not expose some of the recurring issues, that usually Agile kind of highlights by virtue of having a focus on transparency in some of those ceremonies. So something to monitor is that regardless of approach or mechanics, if you want to focus on transparency, if you want to focus on getting the closest as you can in the real-time feedback loops, maybe this isn't the right fit. In addition, certainly we've all been in positions where even in a waterfall fashion, requirements are prone to changing. It makes it difficult to go back in time and refactor or adopt emerging or changing requirements because of the major upstream and downstream parts of a hybrid model such as this. So there are cases where, again, if you manage these big development and testing phases as separate efforts, are you limiting your ability to identify issues sooner? Do you have the potential to stray off course? Are you hindering your improvement in feedback loops, which is big? So ultimately we want to make sure that what we're doing isn't stifling our target outcomes from an Agile strategic perspective as well as from a delivery perspective. So these are all things to kind of keep in mind if you notice a hybrid is prevailing or is something that you've thought about introducing. So in a nutshell, wouldn't recommend considering a hybrid approach when requirements are rigid or constantly changing. Stick with Waterfall or even go full on Agile. If neither Waterfall or Agile is fully baked with your organization or your client, this is something to kind of also be mindful of, is that hybrids may convolute the landscape if there's kind of an all-in shift for either the Waterfall, more traditional way of delivering projects, or being more Agile. So keep that in mind. And in addition, I thought it was important to call this out, is that a lot of us say that we're Agile, but just doing Agile and using the tools doesn't mean that we're being Agile, that we're approaching things the right way. So if you feel like there's a case when everyone is raising their Agile flags and talking about successful transformation, but you're still seeing people do things the old way or not communicating across some of those organizational or business silos, maybe that's an opportunity for you to say, hey, let's experiment a little more with Agile, and let's not just settle for some of these hybrid approaches. So, and I missed the last quote on the last slide, but this one kind of hit close to home because, again, it's a good starting point. There's a lot of input out on the web that says that the way of working with these hybrid models is a really great stepping stone, but just be warned that if this is the ending place, your target destination, there could be some issues that it carries with it. So just keep that in mind. All right. So last couple of things before we start wrapping up here. If you guys decide that a hybrid model, Water-Scrum-Fall, is the right fit for you, certainly there's some tips to kind of make sure that it's a successful and sustainable kind of practice or method of delivery. So the goal here is really to kind of limit some of those traditional boundaries and inhibitors, but still taking steps to be more Agile and promote agility in your workplace. So that first part, when you think about the upstream, you want to limit time planning up front and committing to unknown. So again, a lot of us that have been on waterfall projects, it's very, very possible to take weeks, if not months, to kind of really hone in on your requirements. Try to be a little more Agile in this regard. Put a time box around planning, get to a good enough, and consider breaking a big project or initiative down into smaller projects so you can really get the value out of a hybrid model such as this. In addition, even though the upstream and downstream are both more traditional waterfall, that doesn't mean you can't have frequent and consistent engagement with partners across the business as well as key stakeholders. Certainly, it's important for them to keep guiding the vision and ensure that once you get to development phase and once you get ready for testing, that things are shaping up how they expect. So that's still something that I think we should try to do. Approaching documentation with sustainability and accessibility in mind. So, kind of going after the traditional BRDs and FRDs with this statement. They're good, they have their place, but again, a lot of things can change. So it's important to kind of make sure that when you're creating documentation, are there ways to make it more living and breathing? Are there ways to maybe implement version control? Are there ways to put it out on a shared space, wiki, like Confluence is an example? So again, it kind of just encourages people to approach it with a more transparent way of thinking. And then lastly, when you think about those upstream planning and design phases in particular, try to stay away from getting paralysis from analysis. So, again, as we've kind of thematically hit here already, you want to have enough documentation to educate, inform, and help build the plan and the vision, but trying to capture all the, all the minor details, the minutia before you really start doing any of the development or the coding. It's very easy to get bloat. It's very easy for scope to creep in. So that's one of the more agile things that you can do is try to be cautious and try to help guide the documentation effort up front. In the middle, so swimming with Scrum, this is more of the development layer. You always want to maintain laser focus on team dynamics and team needs. So especially if you're experimenting with this hybrid model, totally encouraged to still procure the services of a Scrum Master or team coach, help keep them on the path, help stick up for them, create that safe zone so they can develop high quality products as quickly as possible, and then also be mindful of any impediments or things that they identify. But in addition, I thought it was important to call out and circle back to an earlier point. Traditionally, your development team is going to gravitate towards being more agile, especially those Scrum practices, a lot easier than others. So, are there ways that we can elevate what they're doing? Are there ways that we can use the development team as a model or learning opportunity for some of the other team and stakeholders upstream and downstream? So definitely keep your developers engaged. Consider partnering your developers with your testers downstream. Likewise with the business, even though, downstream, you don't kind of really operate in an agile fashion, it's still okay to do demos. It's still okay to have them help with the test cases. So there's a lot of ways to kind of use that middle layer as a model to slowly start proliferating upwards and outwards. And then, again, avoid waiting, though, to align with the business owners and key stakeholders until the development phase. So that's the one thing that it's not hyper clear with these hybrid models, is that traditionally with Waterfall, there's a lot of engagement with the business owners and key stakeholders up front, a lot of engagement at the end, especially when you get to UAT and user acceptance testing. But in Agile, we're used to that. In fact, every couple of weeks at minimum, we'll have a demo. Every sprint, there's a chance where we would invite the business owner or key stakeholders to actually test things out, help us write user stories. So any ways you can avoid waiting to just that development effort to get them involved and engaged will likely pay dividends for your entire project. And then lastly, as we kind of get downstream and we look to delivery, focus on those partnerships between the dev and testing phases, as I mentioned. Always strive for more frequent and integrated release processes. So this is going to be the key and critical difference between 100% Agile versus a hybrid, such as Water-Scrum-Fall, is you want to make sure that you at least are finding ways to optimize your process for the future. And traditionally, if you're handing off all of your code to a release management team, and then they have to go through testing and then push to production, find ways to maybe enable that for a more frequent and integrated release process for future projects. So that's also, again, getting Agile to kind of creep a little bit more into some of these traditional ways of working. And then just one thing to monitor is, avoid consolidating testing efforts into a single big bang approach if you can. I know that this is kind of the nirvana ask here, is that traditionally we do approach, UAT is a big push, so you want your users to have that big testing phase. There's definitely going to be like system integration testing or performance testing. Understandably, you may want to consider still siloing those off as separate efforts for a bunch of different reasons. But if you can take steps to incorporate more of the testing into the development lifecycle, you will realize issues a lot earlier and potentially save time and money. But in addition, there's just that timing aspect of if you wait to the end to test and you're not testing certain things at the same time, you run the risk of just a bad situation where you didn't have a right mitigation plan in place. So again, think of ways you can break these efforts down or incorporate them more into the dev effort, and there will be some success associated with that. All right. So again, wanted to give you guys a little bit of some context and commentary to form your own opinions. But in general, wanted to kind of just wrap up that Water-Scrum-Fall from our perspective, great starting point for organizations making the jump to Agile. Conversely, if you're an existing mature organization, but you're still facing some challenges with full-blown Agile adoption, give Water-Scrum-Fall a look. I think if you guys do some exploration on your own, just feel free to Google it, and I'll share some resources that talk a little bit more about the for case and then the against case. But use your best judgment. Understand that this is a stepping stone, and this could be a really helpful way to bridge that gap. But the most important thing is, again, we're big Agilists here. but that iterative way of working will not only highlight opportunities, but it'll help you get more engagement with your business partners. And ultimately, your business typically represents the voice of the customer. So any way you can leverage a hybrid model like this to kind of bridge that gap and get them more involved more frequently, that's a big plus. In addition, you want to drive focus on continuous and frequent discovery and action over the stamp and time planning and rigid execution. So when you think of traditional waterfall, we're not always afforded these opportunities to kind of check in and refactor. So the hybrid model gives you a little bit of leeway there, and that you can stick to your plan, but it's not so rigid that you can't identify new things that emerge and take action on them. So that's a good candidate for something to consider. Just a couple of things to watch out for. Again, don't let this inhibit your test maturity. Typically, in an agile fashion, you design, develop, or build and test during the same sprint. There's a lot of value in that. There's a lot of immediate feedback loops and learning that happens a lot more quickly. So, any case that you're using a hybrid or traditional way to deliver things, just be mindful that you want to try to accelerate and mature your entire test practice and hopefully just not treat it as its own separate effort at the end. Ideally, regardless of what model, what mechanism you choose to deliver your project and manage your project, find ways to align with the values of the Agile Manifesto. I mentioned here, when we try to retrofit or pigeonhole projects or teams into a specific discipline like Scrum or SAFe, Kanban, LESS, or even XP, there's a lot of cases where now the team kind of loses the sense of what's really important, which is delivering value, responding to change, and being open. So always find ways, regardless of how you're delivering the project, to be more agile and lean on the Agile Manifesto there. And then last but most importantly, experiment. Agile is all about experimentation, man. So there's a lot of cases where your organization and your client and customer needs are going to be completely different from the one standing right next to you. So find the right fit. Don't get stuck in the current. Minor pun intended with the waterfall there, but in a nutshell, we wanted to just end and say, the challenge is be responsive, talk to your people, talk to your team members, identify some of the pain points, and then let that kind of dictate what the best delivery approach is for you and your organization. All right. So with that, folks, wanted to say, one, appreciate your time. Again, apologize for a little bit of the late start today. But before we wrap up, I have a couple of really cool little resources to share. But in the meantime, I wanted to kind of just open up the lines. You guys are on mute by default. I don't see any questions queued up in chat, which is totally fine. But while I cycle through the last slides and wrap us up here, feel free to think of any calls to action that this raises in you or that it inspires in you. Any stories, experiences to share, tips or suggestions. Have you guys, in your own right, worked with hybrid models? Have you worked even in an environment where it's kind of 1 foot in, waterfall, 1 foot out with some of the newer things like Agile? Anything that you want to share, even questions or comments related to the topic, feel free to post it in chat or just unmute yourself and feel free to ask. All right. But while you guys kind of gel on that for a moment, just some cool stuff, upcoming events. There's a couple of big three. A lot of events for the summer are selling out. So just a heads up, if you guys are big Agilists or if you have team members and you want to get them more involved with business agility in general, make sure to just check out events that are happening in your area. The Global Scrum Gathering, I hear, is a really, really big one. That's happening in Austin, Texas, from May 20th to the 22nd. More of our tech IT-minded folks. The Agile DevOps West Conference is in Las Vegas. It's a 5-day stint, so I'm hearing there's going to be a lot of good workshops there. And then Women in Agile 2019. Great opportunity for networking for sure, but there's a lot of great female leaders in the industry now. So they're going to be doing a lot of guest speakers and workshops on August 4th to help promote and proliferate business agility. So that's another great one. And then last thing, again, I'll share a PDF. But there's a couple of really great references and additional reading. I mentioned it a few times, so I'd be remiss to not plug the Agile Manifesto. I think most of us Agilists at this point have it burned into our brains, but it's always a good point of reference, whether you fall on Agile or not. But in addition, including Mr. Dave West, the guy who kind of is credited with coining the term Water-Scrum-Fall, you could read a little bit more about his thoughts, as well as a case for and against Water-Scrum-Fall and hybrid models. And in addition, always love to connect. Delane is a really small boutique firm, but our family is growing, our partnerships are growing. We're always happy to consult and partner with you guys in your organization. So feel free to connect with us. You can find our website here. We're pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. And lastly, didn't get a chance to speak today, but a wonderful Sofia Izareta, she works with Delane. She's our marketing guru as well as our training and corporate training contact. So you can feel free to reach out to her if you guys want some one-on-one training or some group training as well. All right. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But before we close the line, any thoughts, questions, suggestions? Hopefully you guys found this topic really fun today. I did, but feel free to share.
Thank you, Frank.
Cool. Oh, yeah, no problem. Thanks, Fatty. Appreciate the guest speaking spot. And likewise, everybody else on the phone, thanks for joining. Enjoy the rest of your month, and we'll talk again next month. All right, take care, guys.
Thanks. Bye.